Hello, my name is Donna Williams, and I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from the book Like Colour to the Blind. This is the third book in the autobiographical series, so there's Nobody Nowhere, Somebody Somewhere, then Like Colour to the Blind, and the fourth book is Everyday Heaven. Okay, this is about, this particular excerpt is about time at a care home. "Feel free to wander around," said the woman who managed the place. Ian and I wandered down to the craft centre. A big dark giant approached me and he put his hands gently on my shoulders as he leaned forward and he stared at me intently, but gently into my eyes. I felt his warmth and his realness, and I guessed that he was looking for mine. A worker approached us. "Say hello, Cleo," said the woman in a sort of irritating, patronising sing-song that you sometimes hear from teachers who work in special ed. Cleo's eyes grew wide and manic. A plastic push-button smile sprang instantly across his face. "Hello," came the robotic words booming from his mouth. The worker, having done her job, walked away. The smile left along with the performance, and so did Cleo. He walked over to Ian and put a hand on his shoulder. Ian put out one of his own hands on Cleo's shoulder, and they searched each other's eyes in silence. The worker bounded over again like some vigilante with a save-the-world martyr purpose. "Say hello," she prodded Cleo, and he stood with Ian. Cleo jumped away from Ian and with the same manic smile springing to his face, "Hello, how are you?" came the robotic though animated words just as before. He waited for no answer, because performances don't need answers, unless they too are in the learned script. The worker took Cleo's hand and led him to the craft room like a pup on a leash. I saw some paint on the light switch. Feeling out of control, I felt compelled to even it up. "Leave the light switch alone," came the voice of one of the other workers there. When she realised I wasn't turning it off after all, her voice changed. "Oh, you like light switches," she said, as though speaking to a very small child.
Gosh.
"We have other light switches."
Jeez.
Ian and I walked to the other side of the room. "No misunderstanding, no misinterpretation, no misunderstanding, no misinterpretation," a man repeated. He kept talking to everyone and no one at an ever-increasing, anxious, increasingly unintelligible pace. "No misinterpretation, no misunderstanding, no misunderstanding, no misunderstanding, no misinterpretation," as though to others he probably looked like he was talking to himself. He came over to where we were standing and he finally fell silent. Cleo approached us and stood silently in Ian's company. Another worker came over. "Say hello," she prodded Cleo. "He's already said hello in his own way," said Ian, fed up with the same robot training theatrics that he'd seen enough of in his own life. The first worker bounded over to join us. "Oh, we encourage them to be polite," she said authoritatively. "You want to be polite, don't you, Cleo?" she said at Cleo. Cleo stood like a stunned child in the centre of a domestic dispute. The noise from the others in the room grew restless. The room felt like a cage full of birds with a cat in it. Ian explained his views on treating people as puppets. The woman reached out and took hold of Cleo's chin with her hand. She wiggled it from side to side as though he was a toy. "He doesn't understand anything, though, do you, Cleo?" she said in a sickening sing-song, as though she was speaking to a plant. Even in this place, that was meant to be a haven, there were corners of perversity, arrogance, and ignorance. Ian and I felt bad and went to leave. A woman with autism made a beeline for the door. On her way, without looking at me, she reached out and gently patted me on the shoulder. Her silence spoke so loudly. Ian and I took a room at a nearby hotel. The manager of the community had phoned ahead for us. "Oh yes, this way to the room," said the woman slowly, showing us up the stairs. The phone rang out in the corridor. "Oh, excuse me," said the woman. "We've got 2 disabled people staying with us," she said into the phone in a gossipy, loud whisper. She pronounced the word disabled in the manner that some people use when speaking about things to do with sex organs. Ian and I looked at each other. "Disabled people," we whispered jokingly. Nobody Nowhere came out in 1991. Somebody Somewhere was written a few years after that, but still in an era when autism was thought to be 4 in 10,000 people, and before Asperger's was a diagnosis in the English language. In that era, autism was presumed that 70% of people diagnosed with autism were presumed to be severely mentally retarded, and functionally nonverbal people were not deemed to generally understand their world. And this, of course, we now know that a lot of functionally nonverbal people are as intelligent as anybody else, albeit commonly having extreme difficulty managing things like involuntary behaviours. And my books were certainly part of changing that world. 3 people with autism, Jim Sinclair, Kathy and I, had started an international organisation called Autism Network International, or ANI, 2 years before. One of the things that this organisation did was to publish a snail mail newsletter called Our Voice. Its membership had now grown to encompass people with autism from all around the world. People who had never had friends, had never been themselves with people who appeared to be friends, or were never understood by their friends, or had a network through which they could share their interests, thoughts, problems, and make contacts. People with autism were now giving talks about their own condition, instead of having non-autistic people do this for them. They were appearing on TV, on talk shows. They were showing up at hearings, institutions and organisations as advocates for one another. Parents and professionals were turning to autistic people for advice when their own outdated theories didn't measure up, or their techniques didn't work as well as they hoped or paid for. Fewer people were now scratching their heads at the word autism, or hiding in shame at the thought that it would bring blame or stigma upon them, their friends, partners, or their families. People were reconsidering things that they had done, as well as their assumptions, their prejudices, and their weaknesses, and the behaviour that had sprung from all of these things. More books and articles written by people with autism were cropping up now in countries all around the world. Some by people who had functional verbal language, and some by people who didn't. In the world of film, where before autistic-like characters had usually appeared without being identified as such, opening titles now directly stated the diagnosis. Hollywood seemed to have realised that there was interest in looking at different people in the movies. And Hollywood had also brought the rights to my own first 2 books. Now there was a film on the horizon. The world was looking again at disabilities, perception, at sensory problems and learning difficulties, and at their assumptions of so-called retardation. It was looking again at the whole idea of normality, at equality and consciousness. Though I hadn't caused the snowball, I had certainly thrown my share of snow onto it, and now there was no stopping it. A manuscript came through the post. It was from a young woman who, like Alex, had begun to reach independence without a voice of her own. She was one of the regulars who'd been writing to us for some time. And like some of the others who wrote, she had a university education, but unlike most of them, she was still functionally nonverbal. Her letter asked if I could read her manuscript. She wanted to get it published. She wanted to be a writer. She wanted to have her voice heard. To give you a bit of history about why I support facilitated communication, I would like to talk a little bit about what it was like for me in late childhood. I was somebody who had developed chronic involuntary avoidance, diversion, and retaliation responses. And what this meant was that when people used my name, they got no response. When people asked a question, they got no response. If they kept pushing, often they would get a response that was completely unreliable. It would be related to anything else but what they were asking. And if they got a retaliation response, they got no when I meant to say yes, they got yes when I meant to say no. Exposure anxiety isn't really the same as oppositional defiance disorder, which is basically just the retaliation side. With exposure anxiety, it's a chronic sort of freeze, fight, flight, self-defense mechanism gone mad, that by the time the person is in late childhood, it's very, very hard for them to outwit or get in first before exposure anxiety has responded on their behalf. And that might mean that they have they're having actions that self-sabotage. It might mean they're having communication that self-sabotages, and that's a very entrapping thing to have. So by the time I was 9 years old, as a person who'd grown up meaning deaf, I was echolalic, and I could store long strings from the TV. I could sing in any voice. I could do a load of TV commercials, but I couldn't answer something like, "Do you want a drink of water?" So what happened was, when I was 9 years old, I was beginning to understand language. So I had been 90% meaning deaf. And then I came to understand around 50% of language. But at the same time, retrieving words was extremely hard, and being able to get language out without compulsively self-sabotaging the language that was coming out, really, really hard. Even if I tried to direct my speech at a person, then exposure anxiety would peak. My communication would become a lot less reliable. And so the only way around that was for me to walk up in front of people and just chatter to myself. But it was so muttered and quiet and half strangulated, because as soon as I knew I needed to communicate, my throat would constrict, as in selective mutism. On top of this, if I managed to get something out, chances were that it would have nothing to do with what I meant to say, or actually be the opposite to what I meant to say. So it was a very hard thing to dare to communicate. Between the age of 9 and 11, because of a number of interventions, I came to be able to understand speech better and began to construct sentences. But these were very clumsy, very stilted sentences and very simplistic. So I remember one of the sentences, I was in grade 5 and I wanted a chair. And I said to the teacher, "I want chair here." And that gives you some idea. My friend said it was like watching paint dry, and that she would get kind of distressed about it and think, "Just spit it out, just spit it out." And so saying something more complex or more emotional generally was an invitation to verbal self-sabotage. So I generally just stayed in my own world and communicated with myself and my reflection non-verbally, so through noises, like sort of stuff. So through noises, I enjoyed doing characterizations of myself, and I'd go off into scenes from things on TV that captured different feelings I was having, what I call talking in pattern, theme, and feel. And I described that in a book called Autism and Sensing, The Unlost Instinct. But how I'm getting back to the facilitated communication subject is that when I was 9, my father did something really that changed everything. And he left a typewriter in my room. And as a result of this, I began to eventually dare to press the buttons, because I was a bit of a button presser. I liked to press elevator buttons and buttons that were just about everywhere. And I got quite excited about pressing cash register buttons. And so here were buttons. So I'd press these and they were printing little letters on the roller. And eventually there was paper left by the typewriter. It took me even longer to dare to acknowledge that, and then even longer to dare to put a piece of it in there. And so as I typed, now the letters were hitting the page, which was absolutely terrifying, because I was a person who had instant avoidance, diversion, retaliation against any connection I was making directly with my environment. So I appeared far less deep, far less intelligent, far less sane than I actually was. I didn't even know that I was capable of a depth of communication. I thought that the clunky verbal speech that I was getting to was as good as I could really do. But what happened with the typewriter is, because there was no exposure, I eventually began doing letter strings and sounding them out, and then I found pop, bob, pop, bob, pop, bob in the letter strings. And I then came up with a word inside and typed the letter string. So cat, come up with a word inside, type the letter string, come up with it, and I made a list of words. And then those words were evoking feelings in me. And because I don't think in pictures, growing up meaning blind, I don't see a picture of a cat. I don't see a picture of anything that I was typing. I get the feel of that thing, or the emotional experience of how I would feel in its company. And I made these lists, these word lists, and then eventually by the age of 13, I progressed to writing these into strings. So I was writing poetry. So at school, whilst I was very, the only speech I used was very practical speech. In typing, I was able to use personal speech. I was able to use emotional speech. I was able to use very expressive, poetic speech that I couldn't have done verbally. But what was exciting for me was that the more I typed, the more I could then come to speak the things that I typed. So when I went to college, because I was doing the homeless thing in my teens because of the type of family I was from, when I was helped to go back into college, I found that that if I could type something, and I began to type essays, they were quite tumbled at first because the exposure anxiety stuff would pull everything all over the place. I couldn't really stay on the one track. But with remedial English, I was able to actually write things addressing specific points and able to write coherently. And then progressively I could start to speak the things I was typing. And so I developed academic speech. And this really passed quite well. So I had my very pragmatic speech. I want the chair here. I had my academic speech where I could rave on an academic topic that I'd already written an essay on. And these days, of course, I became an autism presenter, which I started out as a type speaker. So I didn't start out as a public speaker. I would type all of my interviews, all of my answers. I'd type all of my lectures, and I would stand there and I would read them because if I was to try to speak them, I wasn't able to process my speech at the same time as speaking it. I could hear and I could speak, but I couldn't do the two at the same time. And certainly if I did notice the meaning of what I was saying, anxiety would really rage, and it would be much harder for me to control my body and control my language. So when I was, my first book came out, Nobody Nowhere, was in 1991. And it was not long after that I met a young man who was in his teens who was using a letterboard with facilitation, with assistance. Now, this man had autism. He was diagnosed with autism. And he was also a person who had mild cerebral palsy. So it was understandable that this person who had a movement disorder could be guided in his pointing, his point communication. And this was around the time where the very first communication devices were coming out for people with autism. And he had a little Canon communicator that began to type out little tapes of little paper tapes of things that he was saying. And the good thing about how his mother used his facilitated communication was that she already knew she wanted to fade out that support. She'd already gone from complete sort of finger control to beginning the prompt and then holding back and to feel which direction he was going in. And he had an immense exposure anxiety, which he was able to communicate about, this inability to control his communication, the fact that his movement wanted to go everywhere, the fact that he was feeling compelled to type things that were incomprehensible. And so what this was giving him was an ability to attribute the responsibility to somebody else, so that his exposure anxiety could relax enough to allow the communication out. In other words, this isn't me, I'll just let come out whatever's going to come out. So, but she was, as his facilitator, was wise to this and understood how it worked, and so she progressively faded the support as his exposure anxiety would decrease and allow more communication out. And eventually she came to just holding his elbow, and he would do the typing. Then she came to just be able to tap him on the shoulder to keep him on task, and then he would do all the typing. And he became one of the first independent communicators who had come through facilitated communication. He went on to win a Young Writers Award. He asked through facilitation, he asked his special needs school, when are they going to teach him art history and physics? And then he got to go on to college. He left the special school. He had to fight tooth and nail to do so, because of course they believed, how could they have somebody in there who they thought was not intelligent for all these years? Surely if he was that intelligent, he'd be able to answer things to the prompt about the ABC, about A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And he then typed that he felt that he was basically being treated as such an idiot that he entertained himself by watching them get wound up and frustrated in him not being able to give them the right answers. So this young man went on to be a published author. He's in a number of works. One of those works is Autism and the Myth of the Person Alone, which is edited by Doug Bicklin and contains a whole range of authors with autism who were people who developed communication through facilitation that had become progressively faded out to the point they were independent communicators. And in those early days, of course, there were people who had been through all kinds of experiences. There were who were now talking about what had happened to them. They were talking about it through typing. And of course, professionals did not necessarily want to hear what they were saying. They were saying things like, I have been restrained by, a whole bunch of teachers at my school. I've been pinned down on the floor. I have been terrified for my life. They were saying things like, that I've been living with abuse. Can you help me? And so this upset people because they didn't want to believe that anyone with autism could be abused in a school, in a residential setting. They didn't want to believe that anyone who was a professional or a therapist or a carer or a teacher could abuse a person with autism. They didn't want to believe that people with autism could be traumatized and holding on to those feelings, unable to communicate them. This was extremely distressing for people. So it was much easier to believe that no, all is good in the world, all people who work with and live with people with autism could never possibly mistreat them. They could never possibly lose their own anger management and abuse them. No person with autism could ever have been abused within their family. Even if other children are, there must have been something magical about people with autism and their magical families that abuse could not possibly have happened there. There was also the idea that people with autism surely were not affected by abuse because they were autistic. So if they didn't register the standard reactions to abuse, therefore they didn't feel it. So how could they possibly type about it? So that whole thing about avoidance, diversion, retaliation against expressing your own emotions and being able to get into your communication was actually one of the very reasons that people used as the evidence that their typed communication couldn't be their own. So what happened was, for a long time, people were quite afraid to try facilitated communication with their children. Some people persisted with it, and some of the cases of claimed abuse did go to court, and sometimes people were charged. Other times, those people had their communication devices and letterboards removed from them, because it was then claimed by the people who'd been accused that they were actually being manipulated, and therefore the best thing to do for them is to remove them from the person who's doing the facilitation for them and remove their communication devices so they can't be used or manipulated into saying things that didn't happen. So is it possible that a person with autism could exaggerate? Why not? Is it possible a person with autism could lie? Why not? Is it possible a person with autism could have suggestion put to them and enjoy encouraging a therapist, a carer, a teacher to stay interested in them through continuing or embellishing their story? Why not? Is it true that some people with autism may just have been abused? Why not? So the problem was, of course, that the people who had the power were the verbal people and the people in charge. So instead of accepting that there was a wide range of situations going on, including that sometimes there may have been carers who were so overexcited about the idea that they were the great, facilitator, or that so certain that this person had ability, that maybe they were doing too much prompting, and they weren't facilitating in a way that allowed both the communicator to get their communication out and them to not overly influence the communication, but to take away everyone's communication devices, to slam all facilitated communication as invalid if it happened with someone with autism, whilst still supporting its use in the field of cerebral palsy, as long as they could prove that those people with cerebral palsy were intelligent. Obviously, a huge hypocrisy. I would go so far as to say a social crime that got committed against so many people with autism, until we came to understand that people could actually appear less intelligent, less sane, less capable than they actually were, and that autism itself could sometimes contain mechanisms that made people have tics. For example, I've had some tics that are like this. What? Like the face stretching stuff, and the hair flicking stuff, the this sort of constant thing. It makes you look crazy. So if you've got funny noises and little verbal tics and singular strings from TV and funny movements, and you're trying to communicate, no wonder people look and think, no, that person's obviously nuts, or they're backward, because otherwise they'd control themselves. Well, Tourette's is an involuntary movement disorder. It's obviously it's not a situation where you are able to easily control yourself. There will be people with extreme OCD who are compelled to have to tap things or do a certain chant over and over, who, if you're doing communication with them, they will have a whole lot of behavior that will be very confusing and make them look like a person whose communication is obviously not valid. But if you understand OCD and that it's an involuntary compulsive disorder, and that it happens to people with all kinds of intelligence, and that they're not necessarily crazy even though they have a compulsive disorder, then you realize the crazy person is probably the one making the judgments. There are people who have stereotypies. These are involuntary physical behaviours that a person may have had since early childhood. They're often associated with seizural activity, but they can mean that whilst the person's communicating, they may appear to be uninterested in what they're doing. They may have this sort of sideways looking stuff that's associated with visual perceptual disorders. It also happens with exposure anxiety, the inability to dare to look at what you're doing, but also with visual perceptual disorders. By looking over there, people who normally have visual fragmentation can often see things far more as a whole by tuning out an amount of incoming information by looking away rather than at the target. And so people drew on that too. They couldn't possibly be typing C. They're looking off to the side. They're not even looking at the keyboard. And yet for some of these people, when they did look at the keyboard, it just seemed like a big overwhelming jumble because they generally see things in bits. Or if they had exposure anxiety, looking at the keyboard could bring out a whole lot more involuntary avoidance, diversion, retaliation responses. And so then people would use that as evidence against them that it couldn't possibly have been their communication. So obviously a lot of ignorance and a lot of projection going on to the people who have the types of conditions that those making the judgments have never actually lived with.
I'd met with this psychologist, and he said, "Have you ever heard of RPM?"
RPM stands for Rapid Prompting Method, and it's one of the methods of spelling, which allows non-speakers to communicate by pointing to letters.
And was like, "No, never heard of it." Printed off a sheet, and he gave me a mom's number, and he said, "Go talk to this mom. Her son communicates this way. He's like Houston." And I was like, "There's no way." All right, sure, I'll go talk to her. And she's showing me these pages and pages of things that her son has written. And I'm like, her son must not be that severe. My son had the kind of autism where you smeared feces, where you ran away, where he screamed, where he would run around naked all the time. Houston had no control and no way to communicate to us. So for her to tell me that her son was doing all this, I thought the explanation was he has more control over his body.
Like many parents I meet who have been told for years their kids aren't in there, the thought of teaching them to communicate felt like a fool's errand. Beyond that, spelling is not taught in most schools, and given her situation, it must have felt almost impossible to put money and time, the scarcest resources in her life, behind something she didn't believe was possible. Katie did a bit more research.
We had a friend that uses RPM to communicate, and I went to visit him and literally sat there in absolute shock as he spelled out the answer to every single question that I asked him. I was heartbroken because I realized that my son was in there too, and he'd been trapped for over 2 decades and never given this opportunity to have a voice. So the things that he had lost out on because because I didn't know, and because I listened to all the experts, and how I had failed him. Those were my initial thoughts, followed by, I have to know my son. I went home, I walked right up to Houston's bedroom, opened the door, and I looked at him and I said, Houston, I'm getting you a voice. And he looked at me with the strangest look. I was absolutely resolute that this was going to happen.
And it did. They worked hard. It wasn't easy. It took practice and patience and commitment, but at the age of 21, Houston wrote his first full sentence on his letterboard.
I sat there in shock as my son spelled, I'm in here, on this board.
She holds up a blackboard with stencil letters punched out of it. The board is no bigger than a piece of computer paper, and it is surreal to think that this piece of plastic was the key to unlocking an entire human being.
Yeah, changed our lives. My hope, which had been sputtering along, now it had gasoline. And so it was explosive in our lives to get my son everything that had been taken from him.
Like all parents in Katie's situation, they go through a period of discovering who their kid is and what they know.
I began to find out that my son knew far beyond what they would teach in a classroom. A lot of history, a lot of important events, and spiritual knowledge as well. He had never had any education at all. So I didn't understand how he could know so much.
It's important to note that Houston, like thousands of non-speakers around the world, are not taught as if they're smart. They're often taught preschool lessons like colors and shapes on repeat, even through high school.
He was denied any education because they assumed, based on the fact that he can't control his body, he has no understanding of it.
To quickly interject here, if you have a hard time coordinating motor function and regulating your body, testing behavior is not a good way to test intelligence. It's almost like testing a blind person's intelligence by asking them to read. And this is what Katie's getting at. Houston was denied an education because people were judging his behavior and assuming he wasn't smart.
And when
I'm in my 40s now, but when I was younger, I had significant chronic avoidance, diversion, and retaliation responses. And these developed, I guess, not only in relation to an environment that I found extremely challenging, but because I was somebody who was face blind, who was meaning deaf, who had disconnectedness from my body, couldn't perceive my body as a joined together whole, who would get all other and lose self, get all self, lose other, and find it jolting when people tried to connect directly. Who, when the closer people became, the more that they were in bits, the further they were away, the more that they were whole. And so I found it significantly overwhelming to have people directly interacting with me. The more that they interacted with me, the longer their strings of blah, the more meaning deaf I would become as I progressively fell behind in the ability to try to keep up with speech. So there were very good reasons. Also, things like emotional overstimulation, not being able to control those self-protection responses when I felt emotionally overstimulated by the intensity, by the directly confrontational nature, by the perceived social invasiveness of other people's interaction. And so with exposure anxiety, you learn very early that the ways to manage it is avoidance. If people keep pushing, diversions. If people keep pushing, retaliation responses. One of the problems is that you develop this mentality, this identity, that you are a person protecting yourself from the external world. So you begin to identify as a person who has to protect their own world at any cost, and that the intrusions of other people are the problem. So you get this them and us mentality. And once you get older and you start to see why you want to pursue interaction, you start to see why you want to pursue communication, you start to see why you want to have a body and develop self-help skills. The problem is that by then you've spent several years with avoidance, diversion, retaliation responses, so that they're now like a hair trigger. If you find that you are emotionally overstimulating this person, and that together with overwhelming them sensorily is heightening that self-protection response. You can reduce that in a whole load of ways. One of the most easy things to do is, instead of being opposite them, which is quite sensorily bombarding and in the animal world quite potentially threatening on a physical level, if your nervous system is this hair trigger, heightened reactive state, you go off to the side. Instead of interacting with them directly, which in their state can be taken as socially invasive, no matter how much they want it interpersonally. Instead of interacting with them directly, if you interact through the object and the issue instead of the person, the heat comes off and they can relax. Watch how many autistic people interact with each other. They do so in parallel via an object. When they do tend to bombard each other directly, one will tend to start tuning out the other and becoming indirectly confrontational. So take that as your language. Adapt to your behavior. Keep things small doses. If you always push the interaction to the point that the person went into avoidance, diversion, retaliation, you reinforce the lesson that the world will always overdose them. The world will always force feed them with interaction. You want to turn that around. You want to so leave them with the constant experience that they had been left wanting more, that sets up a competition with their identification with their self-protection mechanisms. How could that stuff be protecting them when the world was not overwhelming? How could that stuff be protecting them when they had been left to do the chasing, when they had been left wanting more? So play hard to get, keep things small doses, always leave them wanting more. Work in parallel, address the object and issue, not the person. Keep things third person, keep them relatively formal, keep them low key. If you're going to praise, don't get in their face with, good boy, yay, look at what you did, because we're not all that type of personality. Our nervous systems aren't all designed that way. And there are a number of people with autism who became significantly more autistic after the big first or second birthday. So maybe the way to praise is, instead of putting it on them directly, is being off to the side, looking at the object and saying, I wish I could do something that good, and then walk off. Walk off to allow them that processing space to feel non-invaded as they digest their own feelings about someone having said something about what effectively is a bridge between their world and your world. And bridges can be threatening. If you believe that other people are the invaders, that they always overwhelm, that they always give you more than you can handle, then bridges are quite challenging. You want to treat those bridges with respect.
Derealisation is a dissociative trait. It's something that was very prominent in my early years with autism. The way derealisation works in you is you aren't connecting with the outside world in a conventional way. You're not connecting in a way which others do, hence the dissociation.
Some of the other things that can happen with people who are communicating via FC is that when you ask them verbally, they may obviously be unable to speak at all, may just make noises, or may be incontinent. They may have things that we tend to judge as meaning they are backward. Well, who says they're backward just because they're incontinent? They may be completely dissociated from their body. And a lot of people with autism from very young give up their hands. They give up that relationship to their body, especially if a carer is taking over and doing everything for them. And especially if they had something like dependent personality disorder, where it was very frightening for them to take independent action, that the more independent action they took, the more afraid they they felt that they would lose the carer, that the carer would go on to just have an independent life. And so once you have these people in adulthood who still have behaviours associated with those issues, such as incontinence, for example, then projecting onto what essentially is a personality disorder issue, or maybe about dissociation from the body, chronic dissociation from the body, or maybe about exposure anxiety and the inability to dare use the toilet. There's also bladder shyness and bowel shyness, where the person actually can't connect to their body as soon as they know someone else can hear or see or smell what they've done. That doesn't mean that was a stupid person. It doesn't mean that was a retarded person. And yet, if this happened to someone with selective mutism or speech aphasia, or who was echolalic and didn't have functional verbal speech, the assumption was surely they can't use typed communication. Now, typed communication is actually simpler for a whole load of reasons. It doesn't involve the interpersonal sense of exposure that verbal speech does. It doesn't involve having to find the muscles, connect with the mind, and integrate, monitor the feedback, adjust, balance a sense of self and a sense of other, a whole lot of mechanisms that are not there when you're typing. That can be really difficult for someone with a significant information processing disorder who simultaneously is tackling anxiety or compulsive disorders. Typing is also, it gives a person more processing time, but it also comes from a different part of the brain to the part that does verbal speech. And so people can actually have speech aphasia with their verbal speech, but be unaffected in their ability to type. That doesn't mean all people can use typed communication. There are some disabilities, like there's one called alexia. It means the inability to perceive print with meaning. So you could even perceive letters and print with meaning. And there are some people with brain injury, including some people with autism, who may be completely unable to perceive print with meaning. But if they've ever gone into McDonald's and known that's where you get food, chances are when they look up and read that word, they know that means burgers. So if somebody even has that level, or Safeway, and they know that means trolleys and shopping, if they even have that level of awareness of the association between a logo and an experience, who says that they haven't been able to read? And a lot of people using facilitated communication, they scan read, they flip pages very quickly. They'll even read the book upside down, as many dyslexic people can. And I have something called visual verbal agnosia, which is the meaning deafness equivalent of reading. It means I could read long strings of information and really struggle to put meaning to what I was reading. I found strategies to overcome a lot of that, not all of that, in adulthood. But if you imagine someone like me in late childhood who could memorize books and reel them off, but couldn't understand even a simple story, and couldn't read a simple story with meaning, of course the assumption would be, well, if you can't read with meaning, surely you can't type. Well, excuse me, does that mean that a person who's dyslexic and can't read because of dyslexia couldn't possibly type a sentence? I think that's a ridiculous assumption. Just because you're a reader doesn't make you a writer. Just because you're a writer doesn't make you a reader. So where we got that simplistic and damaging projection, I don't know.
A group of syndromes called delusional misidentification syndromes. And what happens there is that the type gets confused with the individual case. The right hemisphere is very good at understanding uniqueness. This is almost a core element of the way it works. So it sees the unique person, the unique animal, or whatever it is, whereas the left hemisphere is seeing a category, is seeing how things fall into categories, and therefore the uniqueness gets lost. And one of the things that happens is we are changing all the time. If you meet me this evening I may be in a different mood, or I may check different clothes, might have had a haircut, and the right hemisphere keeps the concept of an individual over time. That is, it doesn't change like little slices of it moment by moment, but is a seamless, flowing experience. And the right hemisphere understands this seamless, flowing experience, whereas the left hemisphere sees reality, and many of the deficit syndromes reveal this in a very dramatic way, sees reality as a lot of slices, rather like a jumpy, old-fashioned cine film. It sees time as just being another instant, another instant, another instant, whereas the right hemisphere sees the thing as a seamless flowing process. Now, if you put those two things together, it can't see uniqueness and can't see flow, instead sees categories and sees them all as disjunct. You can see where we get to in terms of misidentification.
If you were just a little more conservative, and if you were just less outspoken, bit more passive, if you were just the person who would think the most, then finally we could all be happy. If you were just rather less solitary, if you were just more sociable and always jolly, if you had just a bit more color, not too much, then finally we could all be happy. In my world, I may not recognize your face. In my world, everything may not be in place. My world doesn't run like a race, so people like me disappear in the shadows. In my world, there is substance beyond what's here. In my world, inequality's what I feel. My world isn't geared for appearance, so people like me disappear in the shadows. If you had just a bit more muscle, bit less latent. If you were just more kiss my button, never latent. If you were just the person who would just adjust, then finally we could all be happy. If you were just a bit more straight but less open. If you were just a bit less crazy, a bit more sporty. If you were just so normal we could always trust you. Finally we could all be happy. In my world there is no good normality. In my world there is no one reality. My world doesn't have guarantees, so people like me disappear in the shadows. Cinderella bleeding in the shadows of a cruel world, of a fool's world. That's a twist of fate, the prince far too late to choose left to build myself the castle. If you were less eccentric, you'd be fantastic. If you were more production line, that bit more plastic. If you would just control yourself and not be spastic, and finally we could all be happy. If you had just a bit less disability, and if you supported paternalistic charity, and if you contorted all you were, you might just marry, and finally we could all be happy. In my world there's a place for diversity. In my world being art's no perversity. My world's good enough for me, but people like me who live in the shadows. In my world it's a place of patterns and feel. In my world it's a haven for what is real. It's my world, nobody can steal it, but people like me who live in the shadows. If you could just, if you had just, if you were just,
This is a piece of writing called Afterlife. Between dreams, we just sleep, like a spaceman floating thoughtless in space. And you can't be lost. You can't be lost because you've invested in so many souls. And those investments are pieces of you, pieces of your soul, that you have already planted like seeds within others. And every other person who took those seeds and grew differently because of them. You may lose the body, but all you lose is the possession of consciousness. For what our soul was, its essence, lives on in all who we've touched. The power of nostalgia following death, what the dead person leaves behind, is a much more powerful presence than when they were just on the phone. We don't have to own that consciousness. It's the ultimate freedom, setting it free, letting it go, to allow everyone else to carry our soul without effort. And if the one you loved were in another room, are they still there with you somehow within your soul? Are they currently aware of that as they sleep or they read in another room? Or maybe, and maybe not. And does it matter? No. What matters is the trust that we have truly lived our life in which we continually invested pieces of our soul in others. And they will in turn invest some of that into others who we may never live to even meet. And yet, our essence will be there.